Welcome to this episode of Innovating Employment, a podcast by and for workforce development professionals, brought to you by the Ontario Centre for Workforce Innovation. This podcast series asks leaders from across the workforce development sector to share their ideas, experiences, and solutions for meeting Ontario's workforce needs. I'm your host, Connie Tang, and behind the scenes is our producer, Jocelyn Cournier. On today's episode, we talk with Amie Haughn, Director of Employment Programs at the Nova Scotia Department of Labour and Advanced Education. We phoned Amie to discuss Nova Scotia's employment and training services transformation. Hi, Amie. It is so wonderful to speak to you today. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Connie. It's great to be here.
So why don't you start with telling us a little bit about your background and role with Nova Scotia's Department of Labour and Advanced Education?
Sure. I'm the Director of Employment Programs, and that's a division that's located within a branch of the Department of Labour and Advanced Education in Nova Scotia called the Skills and Learning Branch. And my background is I've been in the director role for the last year, but prior to that, I was part of a team that implemented the transformation initiative we're going to talk about today to transform our employment services system to what was formerly called Careers Nova Scotia to what is now called Nova Scotia Works.
Perfect. Can you talk a little bit more about your role in that transformation for
Absolutely.
Nova Scotia's employment landscape?
Sure. We had a team that was pulled together as part of the transformation effort, and it was actually one of the challenges and opportunities in the transformation internal to government is that we did it off the side of our desks in government, and so we scrambled to find FTE equivalents, we say in our world, and pulled on the people in our network internally with the Department of Labour to bring together a group of folks who could tackle a transformation initiative. I was brought on board because of some of my background, not only at the department but beyond. So I had done strategic planning in my past life, and I had some experience with board governance and development as well, and facilitation. And the skills that were required when I was brought on side, which was about a year toward the end of evaluation and implementation, was to work with community stakeholders, work with our partners. And I was a jack of all trades on the team. We did what we needed to do on the team. I facilitated the development of the agreements with all of our service providers, which we'll talk about a little bit more, I think, later. And I also was involved in negotiation of the agreements with all of the stakeholders, further lending itself to consistency in what we wanted to try to achieve.
Wow, it sounds like you certainly wore so many hats in order to get this going. I think it'd be helpful if you could maybe provide us a little bit of context or background of where Nova Scotia was prior to the transformation.
Absolutely. Prior to transformation, and transformation, just to put some dates around it, we flicked the switch, so to speak, on transformation in November 2015. But there had been a build-up to the idea of transforming the system probably since the point in time when the federal government devolved services to the province, which was around 2009. So this idea that things probably needed to change for a number of reasons in the system of employment services was hanging out there, and there were people over that time who started to work on what that may look like. But due to various reasons, it didn't quite get off the ground in the time frame that everybody felt that it might. And so it was really around 2014, 13, 14, 14, 15, where the idea began to have support internally within government, and the idea started to be socialized with our service providers. And the reason it was socialized was really the case for change and why we were looking at change. Essentially, we had a changing demographic in Nova Scotia. We have an aging population and youth outmigration, and they were contributing to a declining workforce. Employers continued to tell us in the department and our service providers how there were workforce issues, and that was their number one main concern. We had 27-ish% of people who were leaving Nova Scotia citing a lack of confidence in their ability to meet their career goals in Nova Scotia. And youth, that number increased. 45% of youth stated that reason for leaving Nova Scotia. And we have jobs without people and people without jobs in Nova Scotia, yet we were hearing this landscape that existed. And so despite the changes that were happening in our labor market economy, the employment services system that we had as a whole hadn't evolved accordingly. It hadn't evolved since 15, 20 years when it grew organically out of the delivery of services that the federal government had had.
Wow, That's surprising and shocking to hear. It sounds like there's certainly gaps on both ends. Can you give us an overview of how did you get those service providers on board and employment services? Because, there was an effort to try that prior to transformation service that we're talking about now. So what
What
changed for this
changed?
one to work? Yeah.
Absolutely. Senior leadership changed in the department in terms of understanding that case for change. We changed the case for change. It was becoming clearer over time. It wasn't about changing the system to reduce costs. And I think previous leadership felt that that was why we were entertaining a change. And the change discussion shifted from administration and cost to client service, to employer engagement, to employer impacts, and individuals in Nova Scotia finding their place in the province and finding their place in the workforce here. And when that conversation started to shift, people started to rally around the transformation that would be required to have an increased emphasis on all these things. Service providers came along a little bit after, of course, the change in terms of them coming on side. The idea was socialized with them in 2014 through a cross-province tour. And so for listeners' understanding, we're a province of just shy of 1 million people. And our geography, I'm told by others, certainly lends itself to some of the things we did to create this environment for change. So there was a tour by our senior executive director of the day to talk about the case for change, some of the things that I just spoke about, and some others I can outline as well. And service providers started to feel the need as well. It was still tenuous. It was still a difficult experience. And the socialization was part of the change management plan, is put it out early and put it out with them and also receive some of their feedback. And then we came back with an even stronger case for change.
That's awesome. I think you've touched on this a little bit already, but would you be able to touch on some of those key pillars, those key points that you were emphasizing in this case?
Absolutely. So after we had socialized, we had some things that we knew, and we also had some things that our service providers told us. And we put that front and center of all our change agents, senior leadership in government. We put that in front of the service providers themselves as well. And those things were that we were investing too much in administration and infrastructure and not enough in the service excellence and frontline service delivery. So we started to equate a shift in budgets, a shift in where we're investing, not in a reduction mentality, but in a, if we could save money in our system, we could invest more in what matters most, which is client service. We also knew that people with specialized needs didn't have enough equitable service access to the services across the province. So as I mentioned earlier, the federal government system had been born out of an organic approach where needs crept up in certain communities, and where an organization that would take on that need crept up at a kind of a grassroots level, which is an amazing effort. Services were provided, but where that didn't happen, a service may not be provided for persons with disability or for persons of a certain culture or background. Various cohorts weren't necessarily being served, and we didn't necessarily have the same services available in each county, in each community. So we had this inequitable thing happening in terms of the service delivery for employment services. Research was telling us too that clients were not concerned about who delivered the service, but that they received quality service when they delivered it. So that was starting to speak to standards and qualifications in our system of those who worked in the system. And students and employers definitely cried loud and hard that they were underserved in the current system of that day. So that was a key message for us as well. There were inconsistencies in standards and staff qualifications, and 90% of job seekers polled under a survey that we had not heard of Careers Nova Scotia, and perhaps not their local service provider, which had, by the way, 52 different names in the province.
Wow. That's no, I mean, I think that that's a common, I don't want to say problem, but I think that's a challenge across many provinces, is that the job seekers, or maybe the people that we would want to help the most and deliver that service to, may not hear of the services that we can provide.
Absolutely, Connie. And the transformation took care of that, because we rebranded the entire system to have one name so that we could start to market it better. We valued the community organizations that were delivering, but it was this mixture that a person needed to work through to try to figure out who was who in our world.
That's so interesting. Can you tell us a little more about that rebranding process and how you really managed to recommunicate this, this big service and be able to communicate it out to these different communities?
Mm-hmm. So we launched the name after we transformed the system. We
Okay.
did not launch it during, and we did not launch it even at the moment when we finally settled on our new service providers. We had waited to launch it until September 2016. So we then announced to Nova Scotia that there is a new service, a new system, and a new name to go with it. And back to the point that it says that the Nova Scotians didn't really care who was providing the service.
Right.
This change wasn't really changing their world in a significant way that you needed to manage that change with them. It was more of an announcement of, here's what is coming, here's the new world, and it's exciting and it's focused on you. And so Nova Scotians accepted that quite easily and willingly, and it has taken some time to get everybody to orient themselves towards a name and use of a name. And we're just about to embark on a marketing campaign for the province, which we've never been able to do with 52 names in a landscape of employment services. We can now say to Nova Scotians, Nova Scotia Works is the place to go for support, to find a job, to talk about your career, to discover what it is you want to do, and to employers to find the people that you need. So that was a whole new element too, to speak to employers. We had never really taken the time to speak directly to them, even though they are now someone who we serve.
Absolutely. I think that having those key messages be the ones that you are emphasized and they're consistent across the board can be so important. I guess it might be actually a little more helpful now to go back a little bit and now talk about that transformation process.
Yes.
Can you give us some context in terms of timeline or like those important considerations that you needed in order to achieve this change?
Right. So we launched with the service providers in November of 2015. We brought them all together in a room in Truro, Nova Scotia, to present to them the business case that had been developed and to also tell them we had heard them. So this was a key moment of, we socialized in 2014, we heard you while we were on the road, and now here is how we're going to do this quote unquote transformation.
Mm-hmm.
So service providers told us they had the expertise and skills to deliver the services to specialized populations. They wanted to be representative of those populations. They wanted to be part of the solution in terms of this transformation. They wanted to have input. They wanted to have some freedom to innovate because government had in the past placed too many boxes and administratively burdensome things on their plates. They wanted to access more professional development. They wanted to have youth and employers as their key client segments, and they could replicate their best practices that they each had across the province. So we took all that in, and what we fed back to them in November and said, we heard you. Here's what we'd like you to do. Here's the case for change. You know what the case change is. We want to innovate, though, toward a vision of a skilled, engaged, and productive workforce for Nova Scotian employers. That's what we're here to do. We want to serve students. We want to serve parents. We want to serve job seekers. We want to serve business owners. Now, here's the vision. How do we get there? We need to reorganize. Mm-hmm. We simply can't have 52 agreement holders across the province. Mm-hmm. We don't want to have doors where individuals are walking through a door for one type of service, but walking through another door for another type of service. And the best and easiest example of that for listeners is the door for disability clients and the door for generic everyone else, which is terrible language, terrible. It's a terrible way to describe it, but we really didn't have a good way to describe what was happening. So we did have services for persons with disability, which is a really great service to have. You want the expertise, you want the knowledge in the people who deliver the service. But what we had were literally separate doors for those individuals in most cases across the province. So if I was disabled, I would go through one organization versus another, rather than taking the approach of, here's where employment services are delivered, and behind the scenes, behind that door, we are prepared to support you no matter what your circumstances and no matter what your journey is in life. That we could serve diverse and inclusive populations was where we wanted to go. So that was a key pillar of our transformation: diversity and inclusion, and one door, and a fundamental shift for the service provider network.
Did you want to talk about any other key pillars or anything else?
Absolutely. So on top of that layer, we also said transformation wanted to focus on client-focused service delivery components, service excellence, and then increasing our reach and access to Nova Scotians. And under each of those pillars, we had objectives and tactics that we wanted to tackle. So maximum reach and access, for instance, we did not want to, through reorganization and restructure and transformation, reduce the amount of service. We wanted to maintain it and increase it. And part of the increasing part is not only more frontline people working with individuals and clients being employers and individuals, but also having virtual presence. So there isn't currently, and we're in the midst of working on it, a virtual Nova Scotia Work Center. And we are in the midst of doing that right now, being able to deliver services in Nova Scotia online and to people that you may have in the past had to walk into a center to receive. So we're catching up with the 21st century.
That's incredible. I think that having something online is definitely so much more accessible for our generation for moving forward. Can you tell us a little more about what that system looks like now? What does that employment service landscape in Nova Scotia look like now?
Absolutely. To start, 52 service providers became 18 service providers. And in that, we now have a group of service providers that is fluid and flexible and nimble to work together to do exactly what they had said they so wanted to do, which was to share best practices and work together. It also creates an environment where, through what we now have as our Nova Scotia Works Service Provider Network, we also have two other key stakeholders working alongside of government and those service providers, and that's the Centre for Employment Innovation and the Nova Scotia Career Development Association. And the CEI, Centre for Employment Innovation, supports research and development for the system so that we're continuously improving and we're continuously looking at best practices and how to leverage that across our whole system. And our Nova Scotia Career Development Association is focused on the service excellence pillar we talked about a little bit, and it is focused on the qualifications and the knowledge and the skills of the workforce that's within the system, because they are Nova Scotia Works. The people in Nova Scotia Works are it. It's not the logo, it is them. So those components in tandem with ourselves in government, who's setting policy and creating accountability and looking at the outcomes, and that's another shift, outcome focused. We're no longer looking at, as part of our system, how many people did you serve as the measure of success, but how have you served them, how have you helped them, what have you done with them, and what is the outcome of the support that you've given to the individual and to the employer. So those have transformed significantly. So there's now 18 service providers, two key entities that surround them to support the service delivery system, and government alongside of that as well to lead and guide too. In terms of client service, every Nova Scotian has access to the same service across the province, regardless of what community they're in. And that has been a big achievement. So one door has been achieved. Everyone in Nova Scotia is able and free to walk through any Nova Scotia Works Centre door, and within that centre, they can find the expertise that they need. That expertise may be in terms of the type of support they need in career development, or it may be simply, I also need some cultural expertise in terms of working in environments where I'm an underrepresented population in Nova Scotia, and I'm having some challenges in the workforce because of that. So those folks are also armed and ready in centers behind that one door.
That's so inspirational to hear. I wanted to ask you about, I know that it's still early. This transformation is only a couple years old. What are you seeing now as some of the short-term impacts and the outcomes from this transformation?
We're client-focused these days, and that's huge. So in our world in government, we would often have a dialogue with service providers that had nothing to do with clients. We would have dialogues about their agreements with us. We would have dialogues about the budget. We would have dialogues about reports. But we were not focused on improving service quality as a team and as a group. And with those entities that we just talked about, with government, the Centre for Employment Innovation, the Career Development Association, and the service providers, we're shifting that dialogue. We're in a place where we're talking about service delivery way ahead of any kind of administrative task. That's been the biggest shift in our worlds. I think what that's translating to on the ground, though, is I've had comments come back to us where people are really starting to see that diversity and inclusion piece and thinking about everyone in Nova Scotia. And we also have a clear-cut approach to service delivery that includes positions that have the same names and titles across the province. So when I walk into a center and I ask for a career practitioner, I'm getting the same thing no matter where I go. So as a Nova Scotian, I'm feeling more comfortable about where I'm going. And the outcomes are great. The measures we have now are showing great success and lots of employment and lots of job matching with employers.
That's incredible. And to see those kind of changes already is so promising. I want to talk about, key takeaways, but I think that you touched on this earlier, and it was something interesting that I would love to talk more about, which was some of the challenges that you kind of had to break through in order to implement this case for change across those service providers, but even for Nova Scotians, right? Like, what were some of the challenges and how did you overcome those?
Yeah, it wasn't all rosy, and we can look back on it now and reflect on it, but in the midst of it, there was a great deal of stakeholder resistance. So one of the most surprising things to folks when we talk about this change is what we did that day in November 2015 with 52 organizations in the room. And we gave the message of the vision, and we gave the message of some parameters of how we needed to go about achieving the vision. And then we asked the service providers, one of our largest stakeholders apart from the client, to organize themselves in that room that day in what we called pseudo regions. And we had given them some boundaries that we thought we should work within, but also said, if you don't feel this works, tell us and we can adjust. So folks sat together in that room in essentially, I think it was 6 at the time, regions to talk about service delivery in that area and how they could reconfigure and reorganize to deliver on the mandate. And they had to reduce administration, and it meant banding together and whatever technical term you want to use, merge or collaborate. And so they were put in a place to have some control over that, but it was a great place of much responsibility, and many times the people who were sitting at that table were talking about their own job or their own change. So leadership to the greatest extent had to be drawn upon from those individuals. And sometimes we saw great leadership, and other times we didn't. We saw fear of change, which is natural. Everything you'd expect under the sun happened in that room and in the coming days as people tried to deal with the change that was imposed upon, but also had some room for them to design and figure out how to go about moving forward together.
Absolutely. I think that being able to hear those challenges, how you overcame them, and also how you worked through them, and then to hear of the incredible impact that this employment service transformation, like you see the impact of it, I think that's so powerful.
We do.
Yes. In terms of, I guess, with your experience and lending from all of that, from those challenges to those impacts, if you could pick top 3 takeaways or what we can learn from this experience.
If you want to undertake a change initiative that looks anything like this, it would need to be done with your senior officials' blessing. And to put that in a term that makes sense to bureaucrats or those who are listening, we would be talking to our senior officials at the deputy level on a weekly, sometimes daily basis during the change. So they were fully informed, understood impacts, and were fully briefed continuously and supportive of the decisions that were being made at somewhat of a ground level. And we've reflected on that on a number of occasions as what was a key to success. And so therefore I turn that into advice for Ontario or anyone undertaking this change. The senior officials, without it, we would not have been able to move forward. Working in government and in a political environment, it was key that they understood everything that was happening and that they believed in the change as much as we did. The solid business case for change I mentioned very early on in the interview was key, and it didn't exist in the early days quite to the degree that it did by the time we were ready and had an okay to proceed with a transformation. So it took several years to get that mark correct, and it took, as you can probably tell, a lot of research and speaking with individuals, all the stakeholders. So you really can't impose this without doing that work. You need to have done the work to be able to go back to all the stakeholders and say, we're listening and we've heard, and here's how we're going to change. In our case, it was a vision that was focused on employers. So employers in the province felt heard, and they have been heard, and service providers in terms of the way we went about the change. We heard them when they said, we want to have some part of this. So please allow us some ability to have some impact in the change. We also had a communication plan, of course, around all those things. So that was key. But primarily it was this ad hoc team as well that came together to do the planning and bring all of the expertise it had to bear when developing the business case and developing the relationships with the stakeholders. The stakeholder resistance piece that did occur, which would be natural in any process, was supported by an executive lead for the project who got out of the chair and moved around the province, continuously meeting with individuals and organizations to talk them through change, and had many phone calls and many emails, and her contribution was definitely key to the success. So if you're going to stand back as government and not roll up your sleeves and get dirty with the individuals who are affected, I would suggest it will not run as smoothly as it could.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Connie. And I would love to come back sometime on year 2, year 3, year 4, because I think the change has only just begun. We've positioned this with everybody. The transformation didn't occur on July 2016 when new agreements were in place. We're continuing to have a continuous improvement mentality around the transformation. There's so much work to be done. One of the things we want to leave with you is change can happen. So having been involved as a service provider at one point in time in my career, and then as the bureaucrat in terms of being involved in the transformation, I saw things and have seen things happen that I would never have anticipated 10, 15 years ago. And although it seems like a very large task to take an entire system and move it, it is possible. We learned that through this process, that if you have a good approach, as we discussed, with listening and then responding, you can tackle a major change like this, even within a government system.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amie. This was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Innovating Employment. To stay up to date on upcoming OCWI podcasts, you can subscribe to our SoundCloud channel at OCWI-COIE, or stream our latest episodes on Apple Podcasts. Stay tuned for our next episode on May 15th, when we're joined by Angela Hoyt to discuss effective approaches to organizational development and employer engagement strategies for service providers. Thanks for listening.